In this episode, we shift vulnerability work from a frantic rhythm of running scanners and forwarding results into a disciplined program that actually reduces risk over time. Many beginners think vulnerability management is the act of finding vulnerabilities, but finding is the easiest part, and it is rarely the part that protects the business. What protects the business is the consistent cycle of discovering what you own, measuring exposure, prioritizing what matters, driving fixes to completion, and proving the fixes worked. If you only scan when someone remembers, you will repeatedly rediscover the same issues and still get surprised by incidents, because the organization never builds the muscle to respond predictably. A program mindset turns vulnerability management into a routine capability with ownership, standards, and feedback loops. That is how you move from a pile of findings to fewer weak points in the environment. As we go, keep listening for one theme. The goal is not more reports, it is less exploitable opportunity. A program begins with a clear definition of what vulnerability management actually is and what it is not, because vague definitions lead to chaotic expectations. Vulnerability management, VM, is the coordinated set of processes that identify weaknesses, evaluate their risk in context, drive remediation or mitigation, track exceptions, and verify outcomes. It is not the same as patching, because patching is one response technique, while VM includes configuration weaknesses, exposed services, weak defaults, and software flaws across the environment. It is also not the same as compliance reporting, even though reporting can be part of it, because compliance can be satisfied while real exposure remains. A program definition should make clear that discovering vulnerabilities is only the start, and that success is measured by reduced exposure and improved response speed. Beginners often underestimate how many teams must participate, because security rarely owns the systems being fixed. A program definition sets the stage for shared responsibility rather than surprise demands. From that definition, the next foundational move is establishing scope and asset understanding, because you cannot manage vulnerabilities on systems you cannot reliably identify. Asset inventory is not glamorous, but it is the backbone of VM, since every scan, priority decision, and remediation request depends on knowing what the system is and why it matters. A configuration management database, CMDB, is one common way organizations track assets and their relationships, but the deeper concept is simply a trusted source of truth for what exists and who owns it. You want to know which endpoints, servers, cloud services, and network devices are in scope, which are out of scope, and why. You also want to know business criticality, data sensitivity, internet exposure, and dependencies, because those factors change how urgent a vulnerability really is. When inventory is weak, scanning becomes a random spotlight, and remediation becomes a blame game because nobody agrees who owns the system. When inventory is strong, vulnerability work becomes targeted, fair, and much easier to complete. Once you know what you have, the program can decide how to discover vulnerabilities in a way that is consistent rather than episodic. Scanning is a tool, but a program treats scanning as one input among several, because different techniques reveal different kinds of weaknesses. Some scans focus on missing patches, others on misconfigurations, and others on exposed services and weak protocols, and each has limitations. If you scan too rarely, you miss new weaknesses introduced by changes, and you allow exposure windows to stay open. If you scan constantly without a plan, you create a flood of findings that nobody can process, which leads to fatigue and shortcuts. A mature approach defines a cadence for different asset types, with higher risk and more exposed assets measured more frequently. It also considers event-driven scanning, such as scanning after major changes, new deployments, or large migrations, because change is when vulnerabilities often appear. This turns scanning into a predictable sensing function rather than a panic button. Even with good discovery, a scanning habit often fails because it mistakes raw findings for actionable truth, and that is where a program must insist on context. Many vulnerability feeds refer to common vulnerabilities and exposures, CVE, identifiers, which are useful for naming issues consistently, but the name alone does not tell you whether the issue matters to your environment today. Scores like Common Vulnerability Scoring System, CVSS, attempt to summarize technical severity, but they do not automatically account for your specific exposure, compensating controls, or business impact. Beginners sometimes treat the highest score as the highest priority, and that can waste effort if the vulnerable component is unreachable or tightly contained. A program mindset asks additional questions, such as whether the vulnerable service is exposed to the internet, whether authentication is required, whether the system is critical, and whether exploitation is likely in the current threat environment. Context also includes whether the vulnerability affects the configuration you actually run, because scanners can sometimes report issues that do not apply due to version detection errors or disabled features. This is why triage is an essential phase, not an optional step. Prioritization is where vulnerability management becomes genuinely strategic, because prioritization decides how limited remediation capacity is spent. A program prioritizes using a blend of likelihood, impact, and exposure rather than using a single technical number, which keeps the work aligned with real risk. Likelihood increases when exploitation is easy and common, when systems are reachable, and when attacker incentives are high. Impact increases when compromise would disrupt critical operations, expose sensitive data, or create cascading failures across dependent systems. Exposure increases when the vulnerable system sits on a wide network, has broad privileges, or can be used as a stepping stone to more valuable targets. A mature program also considers exploit signals, such as whether active exploitation has been observed broadly, because that can change urgency dramatically. Beginners sometimes fear prioritization because it sounds like admitting some weaknesses will remain, but prioritization is honest and necessary. The alternative is pretending everything is urgent, which ensures nothing is actually handled well. Prioritization creates focus, and focus is what turns detection into risk reduction. Once priorities are set, the program must convert them into work that gets completed, and that means building a remediation workflow that respects how organizations operate. A workflow should make clear who owns fixing each class of asset, how findings are delivered, and how work is tracked from assignment to closure. If vulnerability tickets appear without context, owners may treat them as noise, especially if they have seen the same items repeatedly with no clear business explanation. If tickets include asset criticality, exposure notes, and a clear rationale for urgency, owners can make better decisions and defend the time required to fix. The workflow should also coordinate with change processes, because many fixes require planned windows, testing, and careful rollout. A change advisory board, CAB, is often involved in approving changes in mature environments, and vulnerability work must fit that reality instead of fighting it. When security bypasses normal change discipline, it can cause outages, and outages harm trust in the program. A good workflow therefore balances speed with safety, ensuring urgent issues move fast while still being implemented responsibly. Service-level agreements, SLA, become important here, not as paperwork, but as a shared expectation for timing and accountability. In vulnerability management, SLA typically describes how quickly different severity categories should be addressed, but the deeper purpose is to make urgency predictable and fair. Without SLA, teams negotiate every vulnerability from scratch, which slows response and increases conflict. With SLA, teams can plan capacity and schedule work, and security can report progress using a consistent yardstick. Beginners sometimes assume SLA means every fix must happen instantly, but a realistic SLA includes categories, exceptions, and acknowledgement that some fixes require coordination. It also includes what happens when SLA is missed, such as escalation, compensating controls, or a documented risk acceptance process. An SLA is only credible when the organization supports it with resources and decision rights, because you cannot promise timelines without capacity. When designed well, SLA turn vulnerability response into a routine operational rhythm rather than a perpetual crisis. Exceptions and compensating controls are a crucial part of a program, because some vulnerabilities cannot be patched quickly or at all, and pretending otherwise leads to hidden risk. An exception process is the structured way to say a vulnerability will not be remediated within the expected timeline, with a documented reason and a planned review date. Exceptions should not be treated as failure, but they should be treated as real risk that must be visible and owned. Compensating controls are the safeguards you apply when you cannot remove the vulnerability directly, such as limiting network exposure, restricting access, increasing monitoring, or disabling the vulnerable feature. Beginners sometimes think exceptions are loopholes, and they can become loopholes if they are granted casually, but a program uses exceptions to prevent drift and denial. When exceptions are documented, leaders can see the residual risk and decide whether to accept it, invest in redesign, or require stronger compensations. This also prevents the quiet accumulation of long-lived vulnerabilities that everyone assumes will be fixed someday. The key is that exceptions must expire or be reviewed, because risk changes as systems change and as threats evolve. Verification is the phase that separates a scanning habit from a program, because a program proves outcomes rather than assuming them. When someone says a vulnerability is fixed, the program needs evidence that the change is real and that the exposure is reduced. Verification can include rescanning, configuration checks, and validation that the vulnerable service is no longer reachable or no longer present. This matters because patching can fail, change windows can be partially applied, and configuration changes can be overwritten by automation or later deployments. Beginners sometimes assume that if a ticket is closed, the risk is gone, but closure without verification is often just optimism. Verification also helps improve scanner accuracy because it reveals recurring false positives and detection gaps. If the same issue keeps returning, verification can uncover whether it was never fixed, whether it was fixed but reintroduced, or whether the scanner is misidentifying the condition. Those distinctions drive different improvements, such as better change control, better baseline configurations, or better detection tuning. A program treats verification as an accountability step that protects everyone from false confidence. Metrics and reporting are often where vulnerability management becomes either persuasive or painful, depending on whether the metrics support decisions or merely shame teams. A program uses metrics to show risk posture, progress, and bottlenecks, not just counts of findings. Metrics that often matter include remediation time for high-priority issues, percentage of critical assets meeting patch targets, backlog size by severity, rate of repeat findings, and the number and age of exceptions. The goal is to create a decision-ready picture that shows where investment or coordination is needed, such as whether one business unit lacks capacity or whether a particular technology stack repeatedly generates urgent vulnerabilities. Beginners sometimes focus on raw counts because counts are easy to produce, but counts can mislead if the environment grows or if scanning coverage changes. Trend and coverage context matter, because a higher count might reflect better visibility rather than worse security. Good reporting also ties vulnerabilities to exposure and business impact, explaining why certain fixes are prioritized. When metrics are used this way, they defend the program and guide improvement instead of creating defensive reactions. Communication and collaboration are the human engine of the program, because most vulnerability remediation happens in teams that do not report to security. A scanning habit often fails because it feels like security throwing problems over the wall, while a program succeeds because it builds shared ownership and predictable cooperation. That means security must speak in terms system owners recognize, such as stability, service uptime, customer impact, and plan change windows, while still being honest about risk. It also means creating feedback channels so owners can report constraints, request clarifications, and improve the quality of future tickets. Beginners sometimes assume that if a vulnerability is serious, other teams will naturally treat it as urgent, but other teams may be juggling outages, deadlines, and product commitments, so urgency must be explained and negotiated through governance. A program uses clear escalation paths for truly urgent issues, but it also respects that most vulnerability work is planned work that benefits from predictable scheduling. When relationships are strong, remediation accelerates because teams trust each other's information. When relationships are weak, work slows because every request is questioned and every deadline is disputed. Continuous improvement is what keeps vulnerability management from becoming stale, because attackers change and environments change, and yesterday's process can become tomorrow's bottleneck. A program regularly reviews what went well and what failed, such as whether SLA targets were realistic, whether triage accurately reflected real risk, and whether verification uncovered frequent reintroductions. It also reviews coverage, because scanning tools and telemetry may drift, leaving blind spots that quietly grow. Another improvement area is reducing root causes, because repeatedly patching the same class of issues suggests deeper problems like weak baselines, unmanaged software inventory, or inconsistent build processes. Beginners sometimes assume that vulnerability management will always be reactive, but mature programs gradually push left, meaning they prevent vulnerabilities earlier through standardized images, automated configuration enforcement, and safer deployment practices. Even without diving into implementation details, the conceptual point is that the program learns and adapts. When lessons from incidents and near misses feed into better prioritization and better preventive practices, the program becomes more efficient and less noisy. Over time, vulnerability work shifts from constant firefighting to manageable maintenance. As a final perspective, building vulnerability management as a program means choosing discipline over habit and choosing outcomes over reports. A scanning habit produces recurring lists, inconsistent urgency, and a sense that security is always behind, because the organization never closes the loop from discovery to verified reduction. A program, by contrast, begins with clear scope and asset ownership, uses consistent discovery with sensible cadence, and insists on context-aware prioritization rather than raw severity alone. It then drives remediation through workflows that fit real change processes, sets fair expectations with SLA, manages exceptions transparently, and verifies that fixes truly worked. It measures what matters, communicates in business-relevant terms, and continuously improves so the same weaknesses do not reappear endlessly. For brand-new learners, the most important takeaway is that vulnerability management is not a scanner, and it is not a pile of tickets. It is a coordinated capability that reduces exploitable opportunity, strengthens resilience, and makes risk decisions visible and defensible over time.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.